Welcome to Vegas History for Locals. I'm Alan Rogers. I was raised here in Las Vegas, and there's a few things that I love. I love the food that we have here in Las Vegas. I love technology. I love history, and I really do love Las Vegas. I love where we live. I really didn't appreciate it until I grew up a bit and started traveling and comparing the stories that I had to people who grew up in, well, less awesome places to grow up in. I realized that $1.99 steak and eggs after midnight was not a thing for other people. I also learned that, slot machines are not in the grocery stores, and that high school jobs for other people are working at McDonald's and things. And people from Las Vegas all have crazy, weird high school jobs. And, I have loved growing up here. And what I want to do is tell some of the stories of how Las Vegas came to be what it is. I think we have a very interesting culture here in Las Vegas. We have an outsized influence on the culture of America at large. And I want to explore, how that came to be. One of the things also I've seen is that this town has grown insanely since I've been here. When I was born, there were around 500,000 people. Now there are more than 2.25 million people in this valley. And one of the things I love to do when I meet people here in Las Vegas, I like to ask them 3 questions. I like to ask them, why did you move to Las Vegas? Then I like to ask them what they thought of it when they first moved here. And then I like to ask them, what is your story that could have only happened in Las Vegas? Now, Las Vegas, the culture of the people has not had a strong identity. Everybody, when they think of Las Vegas, they think of the casinos, they think of the shows, they think of those things, but they don't really think about the people who inhabit this valley. And I think it's because, we're all from different places. Most of the people who are in Las Vegas immigrated from somewhere else in the United States, whether they're escaping, high taxes and high cost of living in California, or they're escaping the cold and came here from Chicago. We've all come from somewhere else. And because of that, I think we don't have a very cohesive culture. And one of the things I think we can do is we can tell these stories. We can bring these stories together to be able to kind of have a shared identity and to have these shared heroes. One of the things that actually inspired this is my friend Mike Solkowski. He runs a podcast called Come and Take It. It's the history of Texas. And, one of the things listening to that, I've realized that they have a lot of pride regarding the pioneers who founded their communities, all of the different industries and all of those things that make Texas a very unique society. In fact, my brother built a bunch of homes down in Texas. And when he was there, he said he was just blown away by how proud Texans are of their local culture. And I want to inspire the same thing in Las Vegas. I want to start telling some of our stories and make people proud of where they're from. In fact, one of the friends I went to high school with, she actually tells people she's from Tennessee rather than telling them she's from Las Vegas because she thinks it's kind of a trashy place to grow up in. What I want to do is I want to tell these stories and make Las Vegans proud of where we're at. And so I'm going to start to introduce some of the characters and some of the places and some of the industries that make Las Vegas unique and that impact the culture today. And I'm going to do that, by telling these stories. And I got to warn you, I'm not a professional. I'm not a historian. I'm a technology nerdy guy. I just like to read these stories. And so sometimes they might not be accurate. Please let me know if I'm not. Please leave comments and things like that. I'm always learning about this history. I'm also going to be using a long form format. So I'm going to be talking for these are not going to be little 5-minute buzz clip articles. These are going to be longer discussions. Also, I like to learn through pictures and maps and relating some of these old histories to places that we know today. And so I'm going to be doing that through Google Earth. So please go ahead and join along. I have a link in the description that links to the Google Earth file so that you can explore these places as we go through it. Now, the first person that I think we should be talking about, and the first and a name that I think should be a household name in Las Vegas, is of one of our pioneer founders, Helen J Stewart. Now, Helen J Stewart was an amazing and an absolutely remarkable woman. She was one of the first non-native settlers who stayed here in the valley and who didn't get chewed up and spit out by this harsh climate that we exist in. She was supposed to just move here for a year, which, talking to people from a lot of people who live in Las Vegas, a lot of people come here thinking, it's just going to be a year or two. And then they end up falling in love with the place. They fall in love with the weirdness and, the opportunities that Las Vegas brings. And Helen J Stewart was able to take these opportunities and run with them and become a very, very powerful person. Her background gave her these unique abilities to become the mistress of the trail that we're going to be talking about, and to found this city and to kind of guide it in its infancy to becoming a world-class city. Now, I'm going to be using a couple sources here that I really am a big fan of. Now, most of what I talk about is going to be really coming straight from this book. It's called Helen J Stewart, the First Lady of Las Vegas. It's by Sally Zanjani and Carrie Townley Porter. Absolutely fantastic book. It's only about 10 years old. I recommend picking it up. If you really want to have a good time, go to the Old Mormon Fort and buy it there, or the Nevada History Museum. I've seen it for sale there. It's a wonderful book that goes into great detail about what Helen J Stewart did. I'm also going to be using a lot of the pictures from UNLV Special Collections, and I'm going to be using a lot of the pictures that come from Vintage Las Vegas, which is a wonderful website that has tons and tons of Las Vegas historical pictures in it. So let's go ahead and jump in and talk about Helen J Stewart and why everybody in Las Vegas should know who she is. So Helen was born in Springfield, Illinois in the 1850s, around the time when Abraham Lincoln was practicing law there in Springfield and getting his start. Now, when she was about 6 years old, she moved to St. Joseph, Missouri. Now, St. Joseph is an interesting place because it was at the very end of that railroad line. So it was kind of the end of civilization at that time. In fact, what her dad did was he sold he would sell all the equipment and supplies that people would need to go overland and go either to Oregon or to California. Those are the main places that people were hopping off to from. And Helen was able to be here during a very interesting time. In the 1860s, this was before Kansas was a state, and there were tons of skirmishes over this border between Kansas and Missouri because Kansas, there was a big debate whether Kansas would be a slave state or a free state. When Kansas was admitted to the Union, suddenly there was a civil war, and that happened when Helen was, 7 or 8 years old. And I can't imagine, the conversations she heard and the excitement around there. In fact, during the Civil War, which, kicked off while Helen was here, there were actually skirmishes, and the Missouri bushwhackers came in and actually raided St. Joseph. So she saw that she was here during a very tumultuous time. It was a very interesting time to be here. And, at a certain point, her dad decided, there's this violence here, the Civil War, and I've been, outfitting these people to go to California. Why don't we go ahead and head to California ourselves? And so they did. They took this overland trail. This I just can't imagine doing this either. This was the time, if you played the Oregon Trail game, I hope you didn't get dysentery, but this was one of the things that would happen is they would go through this California Trail. And during this time, this multi-month journey, the Weiser family, their horses got sick and they got stuck here in Fort Churchill, Nevada. So Nevada was still a territory at this time. It was actually just a year before Nevada would become a state. And Helen and her family got stuck on the trail here for a bunch of weeks. And I think this is going to be interesting later in Helen's life because she is going to be kind of sitting there on a busy trail, watching all these people come and go. And she got her first taste of Nevada and the harsh environment of Nevada here in Fort Churchill. And she got her first life of what it was like to be that stop on the trail. Now, eventually her family, they were able to successfully get down into California. They settled south of Sacramento in a place called Galt. And, it was a farming community, and they went and were farmers for a little while, but then Helen's dad, he decided, his name was Hiram. He decided he wanted to become a prospector. And this was, years after the gold rush of 49, but there was still a lot of mining claims that were happening all over this community, all over the place. And so Helen was, left with her brothers and sisters and her mother to fend for themselves. And Helen was able to receive an education. Helen's mother was very, very serious about her children receiving an education. In fact, Helen was sent away to college at Hesperian College in Woodland, outside of Sacramento in 1867. So when she was like 13 or 14, she was sent away to get her education. And this is where she learned things like, the classics, poetry, math, and the sciences that were available then. So it was the Victorian period. So think about these women wearing lace and these big dresses, going to college here in this little college outside of Sacramento. So after she received her education, she got married. At 19 years old, she met this man named Archibald Stewart. He was 40 years old, so almost twice her age. He was a well-established gentleman, and they really did fall in love with each other, which was very nice for the Victorian times, because sometimes people were just married for, family connections or to get money and things like that. But Archibald and Helen were really in love, and we have letters that talk about how much she liked his wavy hair and things like that. And, so he was in Stockton, but they didn't stay in Stockton, California very long. They packed up their belongings pretty quickly and headed out to this place called Pony Springs. Pony Springs is about 30 miles north of Paiutes in Nevada. And they came out here because Archibald wanted to try his hand at prospecting. He wanted to make it big too, with the gold. But actually, I think it was more silver in this place because we are the silver state. And now, Helen, when she was moved out here, she was pretty miserable. She did not enjoy living in Pony Springs because she was all alone. This is when they actually had conceived their first kid and had William. Now, when it was time to deliver William, they did go down to Paiutes to have the baby. And that's when Ellen realized that she needed to be in civilization. She really missed the company of other people, especially the company of other women. And so, a few years after they moved to Pony Springs, they decided to move down to the main city of Paiutes. Now, Paiutes is an interesting place. If you live in Las Vegas, I really, really recommend that you take a trip up to Paiutes. In the 1870s, it was known as one of the most lawless places in America. They said that they had more than 70 deaths due to homicide in this town of, I think it was a couple thousand people in the 1870s. So if you go up there today, you can visit the Boot Hill Cemetery, where on all the headstones, they describe how these people were killed in the 1870s. It's really, really interesting about, over a dog and stuff like that. There's the Gem Theater. There's the Overland Hotel, which is this old haunted hotel that you can go hang out with. Go to Paiutes. It's a really, really interesting place. So when they moved to Paiutes, Archibald kind of changed positions. He started selling equipment. And at the time, Paiutes was kind of shrinking. A lot of these mining claims were being tapped out. And Archibald was making his money, but he made more money off of selling supplies than he did from his prospecting. He also started dabbling in investments, and he invested in a gentleman named Octavius Gass, who came to Paiutes asking for money. Now, Octavius Gass, he was running a little ranch in this dusty part of Nevada called Las Vegas, and he had to borrow some money because he'd fallen on hard times. And so Archibald lent him this money, but a little while later, Gass defaulted on that loan. And since Paiutes was rapidly declining at that time in the early 1880s, Archibald looked at his family, and they'd had some more children since they came to Paiutes as well. They had two more children. They had Tiza and Hiram, named after her father. So now they're a family of 5 out here in Paiutes. And they've got to learn how, they've got to figure out what the next move is. They made this investment in Las Vegas, and it was time to save that investment because Gass was going to default on his loans. So they packed up their family and they decided to take that dusty trip and move down to Las Vegas. So this is around 180-mile journey to get down to Las Vegas. And you have to remember at the time that, through horse and carriage, and this is a family of 5 moving through these dusty places, you could only make around 20 miles a day. So it was, a good week-long journey to get from Paiutes down to Las Vegas. And what did Helen and her family see when they came to Las Vegas? They saw something like this. This is a picture of what the gas farm looked like about the time that Helen J Stewart came into town. Now, Paiutes, we think of Paiutes as a little tiny place, but back in 1882, when Helen J Stewart moved to town, Paiutes was giant compared to Las Vegas. Las Vegas just had a handful of people, a very, very small number of white settlers and mostly Native Americans. In fact, I want to talk about kind of what Helen J Stewart had moved into at this time, and talk about the people who came before, because there's some very interesting stories here. So the first group of people that we need to talk about were the original inhabitants of the Las Vegas Valley, the Southern Paiutes. Now, the Southern Paiutes, they had this, they had this large range where, through southern Nevada, northern Arizona, and southern Utah. This is where the Paiutes lived. Now, the Paiutes were, compared to a lot of their neighbors, they were a very, very poor band of Native Americans. In fact, the Utes would come often and actually take the Southern Paiute children and take them into slavery. The Shoshone were much more calorie sufficient and had a much larger culture and much larger society. And in Las Vegas in the 1850s, they say that there were only around 1,200 native inhabitants or so around that time. And the Native Americans here, they had a rough go of it. They were quite migratory. They didn't live in the Las Vegas Valley because it was just too hot. Now, we have to remember that humans have been able to live in places that have been colder for a long time because we knew how to, we created fire and we could make cold places warm. But back in these times, there was no way of making a hot place cooler except for evaporative technology. They had some very, very, rudimentary ways of helping do that. And this was one of the most extreme places in the entire world, right? Part of the range of the Southern Paiutes was Death Valley. And Death Valley is the hottest place in the entire world. So think about just this dry place, very hot. It was all about the springs. And the whole reason anybody lived in the Las Vegas Valley was the fact that there were these artesian springs that sprung up everywhere. In fact, even today in Las Vegas, the water table is very, very low. In fact, some of the places on the strip, like where the Luxor is built and where the Mandalay Bay is built, if you go underground, it's just a few feet until you start hitting water. In fact, some hotels are sinking into the ground because of the amount of water that we have underneath Las Vegas. And Las Vegas got its name for that. It was called the Meadows because we had this giant, we had really, really tall grass that actually grew naturally around all these springs. And so the Native Americans, they would congregate around these springs. It was required for life. That's where they would find things. But it was a very calorie poor situation. It was just really hard to find enough to eat. The ground was so alkali and so difficult to plant in that that the Southern Paiute did not plant a lot of crops. In fact, when settlers came through, they actually improved conditions by bringing some of these some crops in. Now, to exacerbate this idea that the Utes next door were harvesting slaves from the Southern Paiutes, they also had a super busy. Well, I guess it wasn't super busy, but this big road that was going right through the valley, and it's called the Old Mormon Trail or the Old Spanish Trail before that. Now, again, when we talk about Helen J Stewart, when she moved in, it was called the Old Mormon Trail, but it was this trail when the Mormons used it that followed all the springs, and you can kind of see all the springs that followed all the way down from Salt Lake to San Bernardino. So the Mormons had settled a lot of Utah during the 1840s and 1850s, 1860s. So Brigham Young wanted to create a settlement every 20 miles from Salt Lake City to San Bernardino, which was the other major Mormon settlement. And, there were some parts of the trail that were much, much rougher than others. In fact, if you look at here, there was quite a big difference between Las Vegas and Moapa, where these two springs were very far away from each other. Now, back before the Mormons used this trail, it was used for Spanish traders who were trading goods between Los Angeles and Santa Fe, New Mexico. So these people would make this pilgrimage, and it was used as far back as the 1770s. This was an established trade route. And when these traders would take all their goods from Santa Fe, bring them over to Los Angeles, on the way home from Los Angeles to back to Santa Fe, they would actually take a lot of the Paiutes with them as slaves and bring them with them, which again exacerbated the population issue. So this old Spanish trail was one of the distinguishing features of the Las Vegas Valley when Helen J Stewart moved into town. And you can see here's an old dusty shot of that Spanish trail going past Red Rock Canyon. So one of the other inhabitants of Las Vegas and the people who really decided that this was going to be the place where Las Vegas started were the Mormons. So the Mormons were called to a mission. Again, Brigham Young wanted to establish those outposts every 20 miles or so. And he called a Mormon mission in 1855. And so all these guys had to come, they didn't really volunteer. They were told, hey, you're going to go to Las Vegas and settle this place. So they came in 1855, in June of 1855. And they set things up. They found this little creek, the Las Vegas Creek. And, they made that last 50 miles of the old Spanish trail. That last 50 miles, there's 50 miles where there's absolutely no water. And if we think back to it, you can only really cover 20 miles in a day. So by the time they reached Las Vegas, their cattle and their horses were dying of thirst. In fact, they had to send people ahead. And the first substantial source of water they found was this Las Vegas Creek right here on Las Vegas Boulevard in Washington today. And they had to send people back to shuttle the water. I mean, it was really, really hard even just to get to this place. And then when the Mormons settled here, they had a rough go of it. It was very, very difficult to plant crops. They did set up a fort in kind of that the Spanish mission style, where you had a military base to reject any Indian attacks or Native American attacks. They didn't really have to worry about that. But so they spent all this time creating these adobe bricks, put this fort together, and then started to plant crops and irrigate. And they did that. And at first they had a little bit of success, but a lot of things didn't grow there. And it was just extremely hot. When they started growing things and they tried to plant things as soon as they got there, a lot of those things just burned up and didn't grow. When their families came down the next year, they realized that they just could not make enough food to support themselves. And there was some other drama with Mount Potosi and stuff like that. We'll actually talk about that in a future episode about the Mormons' history here. But they didn't last very long. They only lasted around 2 years before they decided that they'd had enough and they decided to leave. And so after they left, we had the next resident of this area. And, we're going to talk about Octavius Gass. He's the guy who went to Paiutes to ask for money. So Octavius Gass was a 49er who ended up in El Dorado Canyon, which was a place that got pretty busy because of mining. There was a lot of gold and silver mining that happened down in El Dorado Canyon. And, he passed through the valley and realized that there was this old abandoned fort. And, the people in El Dorado Canyon, they needed to eat, and there was really no source of food or anything near it. So Gass started ranching and farming at the old Vegas fort. He actually lived there for about 20 years with his family, and he did a lot better than the Mormons did. He expanded upon the farming. He had a successful ranching operation and started that trade route between El Dorado Canyon and his farm here in Las Vegas. In fact, there's this great picture of Octavius Gass in front of his house. And we see here's the old Las Vegas Creek. And we can see his adobe structure here. And in the back, this structure still exists in Las Vegas today. This is that adobe structure at the back of the fort. In fact, if I close this down, we should see that little smokestack is that same here. So, and the main house was right here, right almost on Las Vegas Boulevard, right where the trail passed, right? So Octavius Gass lived here for about 20 years. But at the end, he just couldn't make it. There were a couple of rough seasons that, and the Native Americans, they would take a lot of his food because the alternative was starving to death. And, Octavius Gass, he worked with the Native Americans pretty well until it became a problem where he just wasn't able to make ends meet. And that's when he went up to Paiutes and took out that loan so that hopefully he could, hopefully he could continue this venture, but he lost it. He lost the ranch, and he actually ended up moving to Arizona and becoming a legislator and all sorts of interesting things that he did later in life. But he couldn't make Las Vegas work. It was just too harsh of an environment, and he ended up abandoning it. And that's what Helen J Stewart walked into. Now, I do want to talk about some of the neighbors that Helen had when she came into Las Vegas. And the first one I want to talk about is her neighbors and her main customers, right down here in El Dorado Canyon. El Dorado Canyon was a mining community. There were hundreds of people down here. Even it got up to thousands at certain points during this time. And El Dorado Canyon was a rough place. It was a lawless place. There was nobody collecting taxes down here. There was no law. It was just a bunch of men out here in the middle of the desert, digging around in rocks, trying to find silver and gold. And but it was a really, really busy place. And this is really going to be the main way that Helen J Stewart and her family are going to survive, is by trading with all of these prospectors down in El Dorado Canyon. And if you go there today, in fact, if you've have any photographer friends, or you've probably seen pictures of people with this as the background, it's a really fun place to go visit. In fact, my dad's friend kind of reestablished the place, brought in all of these old buildings, and it's a really, really beautiful place to go visit. But boy, is it hot there. I just can't imagine being one of the miners down there in the 60s, 70s, 80s. Another neighbor that we had at the time, in fact, the closest neighbors, they moved in around 7 years before the Stewart family would come to Las Vegas, and they were the Kyle family. Conrad Kyle, he was an old dude in his 70s. He'd moved out to Las Vegas on a spring that was only about a mile and a half away from where the Stewarts would be setting up camp. And he was known to employ a lot of interesting characters. So again, Las Vegas is in the middle of nowhere. There's no law here, and just a couple of settlers. And Las Vegas was known as a place where if you were in trouble with the law, you could come to the Kyle Ranch and get a job and hide out from the law and wait for things to blow over. So, you had all these ruffians who ran, and this was not a farming operation. They ran a farm, they ran a ranch, and they were all ranchers, herding cattle and moving horses and things like that. And they were a rough and tumbled bunch, the Kyle brothers, the Kyle boys. They also have, that Kyle name might sound familiar if you're familiar with the canyons around Las Vegas. One, back at this time in Las Vegas, if you needed lumber, if you needed wood to build your houses, lumber was like, the main building material at the time, but none of it was in Las Vegas. There were no big trees back then here, right? It was the Meadows. It was just a bunch of big, tall grass. And so the Kyles, they ran a farming operation up there called Kyle Canyon. And if you've been in Vegas for a while, that's, the main canyon that you think of when you think of going to Mount Charleston. So they had a lumber operation up here in Mount Charleston. So think about coming out to every time you need to go get wood, having to come all the way out to Mount Charleston. That was a multiple day journey to get out there. Then you had to cut down the logs, process them, put them on your wagon, and then bring them all the way back to Las Vegas. So wood was a very, very precious commodity in Las Vegas at the very beginning. And the Kyle family, they helped establish that. So the other non-native inhabitants of Las Vegas Valley, they weren't really in the valley. They were out there in Red Rock Canyon at the Sandstone Ranch, and it was a gentleman named Jim Wilson. So Jim Wilson was a soldier who was stationed at Fort Mojave during the Civil War, and he fell in love with the area when he was passing through. Fort Mojave was at the very, very tippy bottom of Nevada. And, he went through Red Rock Canyon and he just loved the area. And so he created his Sandstone Ranch up there near Red Rock Canyon. He had two half Paiute boys that he claimed. And he was, and he had a pretty happy life out here. Again, he was ranching, mostly doing cattle and things like that, and living right at the bottom of Red Rock Canyon. He just had one of the best views out there and ran his little operation with his sons. Now, if you go up there today, Spring Mountain Park, you've probably seen Super Summer Theater. If you're from Las Vegas, that's where, we have that outdoor amphitheater, and it's just a beautiful place. And his ranch is still out there, and his cabin, and it's a really, really neat place to visit. In fact, if you look over here on the left, these are some of the grapes, and they're actually related to their cuttings from the original grapes that were grown at the old Mormon fort. So I don't know, that's kind of a nice little fact is those grapes are pretty OG for Las Vegas. So those were the neighbors. You had El Dorado Canyon. You had the Kyles, you had Jim Wilson. You actually had one other gentleman who was a coal miner around 10 miles away from the Stewart Ranch, and it was 1882 when they rolled in. 1882, just in context, that's the time when Billy the Kid was doing his thing. That's when the shootout at the OK Corral was happening, but also when the Brooklyn Bridge was being built. So still old Wild West, especially out here, but technology and things were improving in the United States, and there was rapid industrialization in other parts of the country. So Helen and her family, they moved in and settled down. And one of the first things that happened was, this family of five, they became a family of six. So before Helen left Paiutes, she knew she was pregnant, and she actually went and had to talk to the doctor and said, "Listen, I'm going down into the middle of nowhere and I need to learn how to deliver my baby." And so he gave her some pointers. Again, thinking about going down into the middle of nowhere. There were no doctors around, nobody to help. And she thought she was going to be all on her own to have this baby. But the good news is that she was able to have her baby. And this is Eveline La Vega Stewart. La Vega for Las Vegas to recognize their new home. And Helen did have some help, though, with having this child. There were the Paiute women who were around, who Helen was able to have an amazing relationship with. In fact, I think this is one of the definitive relationships between some of these people. Helen J Stewart was always really kind to the Native Americans there. She would employ them often. And one of the things she would do is she would trade with them. Instead of giving out food, she always said, "Hey, I will trade you food, and I'll trade you these items for baskets." And she started to collect a lot of these baskets from the Paiute women. And she respected them, and she learned from them and learned how to survive in this hot, dusty place, this place that so many other people couldn't learn how to live in. So the Stewart family, they settled in, and they started to get used to their new life here in Las Vegas. Part of the half of their job was the farming, and again, they inherited a lot from gas. The soil was still awful, and they had to work so hard, composting and things like that to get the soil to actually, to grow anything. Here we see some of the orchard, and I think this was actually taken way later, but we see the orchards that they were dealing with. So they would grow all these fruits and vegetables, and also do a lot of the ranching, cattle and horse ranching. And then they would send it down to El Dorado Canyon, which was a couple days journey. And that was the patterns of life there. They grew grapes, and they actually used to ferment their own wine. And there's some funny stories about how every time the wine would get fermented, that that there would be no work being done for a couple of months because everybody was laid up and inebriated. And they lived on this little place in Las Vegas where on this busy Old Mormon Trail, and they would constantly be having visitors staying in, and they would always, as soon as you came over Apex, the most noticeable feature of the valley was the Stewart Ranch. In this dark, or this dusty desert, there were suddenly all these trees, and you could see a house, and so everybody who came through town would stop at the Stewart Ranch. So they were constantly had people over for dinner and people that they were entertaining. So they were going through these and doing pretty well in Las Vegas. And then something happened in July of 1884. By the way, a couple years in, Helen is pregnant with her fifth child, and Archibald is down in El Dorado Canyon. He had been doing some trading down there at El Dorado Canyon, and Helen J Stewart was dealing with a ranch hand, and the ranch hand accused her of ripping him off and said all sorts of nasty things to her. Right. So Archibald, he gets back from his trip to El Dorado Canyon, and Helen says, "Hey, there was a dust up. I had words with this ranch hand who is living with the Kyles, who's, one of the Kyle ranchers." And, Archibald heard about that, and he decided to take care of it in the way that it was taken care of in those days. He wanted to go have a conversation and defend his wife's honor. So he got on his horse, right after he got back from El Dorado Canyon. He jumps on his horse, goes the 1.5 miles down the street to the Kyle camp, and he never comes back. We don't know exactly what happened, but we know that Helen received a note later that night, and the note read, "Mrs. Stewart, send a team and take Mr. Stewart away. He is dead. Conrad Kyle." And so she did. She actually went down herself and saw her husband under the blanket, and they really did a number on him. He had multiple gunshot wounds. He'd been bashed across the face with a rifle. Some of the shots happened very, very close to his face, and she was outraged. She took her husband, took his body, put him on a little cart, and brought him back to the old Mormon fort, the Stewart Ranch. And I just can't imagine that. I can't imagine. So put yourself in Helen J Stewart's shoes. It's, she's 30 years old, right? She's lived here for a couple years. She was only supposed to live here for 1 year. Archibald told her, "Hey, we're going to go down. We're going to turn around our investment. We're going to sell the ranch. We're going to make all of our money. And then we're going to get out of here so you can get back to civilization." Helen hated being alone, and she was all alone here in this valley. She was even more alone now because her husband had been killed by her only neighbors, these guys who lived 1.5 miles up the street. She was worried that they would come and finish the job. So she didn't know what to do. She has 4 children, a year-old baby, and then her oldest was 9. So all these small children. She is, this little Victorian lady. She was also very physically diminutive. She was about 5 feet tall, 100 pounds. She was just this skinny little thing that was expected to now survive in one of the harshest places in the world to live, a place that a lot of people couldn't make work. And she had to make a decision. I mean, I'm thinking about that night, sitting there, also it's July in Las Vegas, and I just can't imagine the heat and being uncomfortable, being pregnant and having all of these children around and not knowing what to do. on one hand, what do? Do you go back to your family and give up on this investment? Do you continue here? And what does that look like even? How's this going to work with these murderous people who are living right up the street? And this is when Helen had to make a decision for herself. And again, that night, with her husband's body sitting there, actually she put it in the river to try to preserve it and keep it cool. And she had to decide whether she was going to stay or if she was going to go. And that's when she decided to stay. So, and I like this little view. This is where the Helen J, the ranch house was back in the day. And you can see here, just to the right is Las Vegas Boulevard. And on the left is the Natural History Museum. And there's that little Las Vegas Creek with the trees around it. And, she had to make that decision of what do I do? And she decided at that point that she was going to give it a go, that she was going to stay, that she was going to continue running the operations, try to make some money off of this property, turn around and get back into civilization. And this is where I think Helen J. Stewart becomes a great woman. This is where she takes up she takes her life in her hands and she takes her fate and decides to become either, someone who's going to fail out here in Las Vegas or somebody who's going to be a great person. Helen, because we're talking about her, spoiler alert, she becomes one of those great people. And so, after her husband's death, Helen had to do some work. The first thing she had to do, she had to go back up to Paiutes, again, 180 miles to get back up to Paiutes and go across the street from where she used to live. And their house when they lived in Paiutes was right across the street from the $1 Million Courthouse. And there were a couple of things that she wanted to do. She wanted to prosecute her husband's killers and get justice for him. But unfortunately, that didn't happen. It took years. They had to find the guy and then put him up for trial. And there was a mistrial and all that stuff. Nobody was punished for the death of Archibald Stewart. And she also had to fight tooth and nail to get the deed, to get what was owed to her. I mean, there was a will and everything, but the people around her here tried to take Helen's property away from her, saying that there's no way that she could manage it on her own. And there's no way that she could be successful. And so she had to find character witnesses and go through all these hoops in order to even get to legally own that land so that she could go and sell it later. And this is the time, and everybody in Paiutes thought she was crazy for even trying to do this. They expected her to fail, and they thought it was kind of a joke what she was trying to do. Now, at this time, she sends back and talks to her dad, and he actually comes out. So good old Hiram, the old prospector, the guy who's, who came across America, comes down to Las Vegas to help his daughter out. And together, they really make Las Vegas, this Las Vegas ranch, they make it become more and more successful. It wasn't always easy, but she got it there. So I love this picture of Las Vegas. This kind of shows that old Mormon Trail passing next to the Stewart Ranch. This was a little bit later when they had more buildings on it, but you can just see how desolate and how lonely of a place that was to live. So, Helen came here and she went to business. They continued to do the farming. They continued to do the ranching, and she raised her children out in the middle of nowhere. Now, one of the stories about Helen J. Stewart that I think is indicative of what Las Vegas has become today is about hospitality. Now, even today, there's really no reason for anyone to ever come to this part of the world, right? It's a really, really hot place. I'm recording this in July. It's going to be 110 degrees, this weekend. There is really no reason. And it's not like it's like on a major thoroughfare or anything. There's no reason for all these people to come to Las Vegas today, except for our hospitality. We know how to treat people better than anywhere else in the world. And Helen J. Stewart was the first. She would often, there were stories about, you would actually see the dust cloud before you saw any of the people come. And she'd see the dust cloud off in Apex and see these people coming in, and she would put the tea kettle on and start up dinner. Helen never knew how many people she was going to be hosting for dinner, with all the Native Americans hanging around her ranch, with all the ranch hands and the hired help, and then the people who were passing by. It was always a big question of how many people she should make dinner for. But she was known as a gracious host. She was known for a few things. First of all, she was known for being able to size people up really well. She was a great judge of character. Everybody said that she could tell the bad guys from the good guys really early, and had the bad people move on, and the good people could stay for as long as they wanted. She was also famous for making people stay for longer than they anticipated. After that, they would get through that 50-mile journey with no water. They would get there, and their horses were emaciated. Everything was in a rough condition. And she would say, hey, come here and stay and recover. And then she was such a great conversationalist, since she was so starved for attention and starved for society, that she would talk to them. And she apparently had the gift of gab. She was a great conversationalist, again, educated and smart, and people just loved talking to her. And they would stay multiple days just because of how gracious and wonderful of a host she was. Which, again, I think is really what Las Vegas is all about. This crazy place in the desert that you stay at because, it's got some amazing things to experience. Another thing that she did was, these folks who would come in, she would do horse trading with them. And these horses, when they got there, and the livestock, when they got to Las Vegas, were in such a bad condition that Helen would say, hey, these look rough, but I'll take them off your hands for a fair price, and I'll sell you these other ones that I've rehabilitated from the people who came before you. And so she was able to make quite a bit of money and had quite a herd. That she was able to leverage for more and more cash. And this is how she was able to really start to excel. Both the trade with El Dorado and the visitors and the horse trading, she was able to do pretty well for herself. Now, one of the things that she liked to talk about was how she did engage with the Native Americans, with the original inhabitants of Las Vegas. Here's actually a picture of one of the girls who worked on the Helen J Stewart ranch, and one of the couples who worked with her. And so Helen J Stewart had to deal with a very diverse group of individuals. One of the early settlers of Las Vegas was actually a black guy who lived out at Springs Preserve, where that is, at the Big Spring. She had Jim Wilson with his half Native American sons, and then she had all of the Paiutes around, and then she had all these travelers coming through. And it must have been a very interesting experience, or must have been an interesting confluence of people, where all these different races, all these different ethnicities were coming together and working to try to make Las Vegas make Las Vegas successful. Again, a lot of people had not made it very successful, and by working together, they really did. And if you look at Las Vegas today, it's one of the most diverse cities in the United States. And all these people are working together to make this mirage in the desert, a reality. One of the people who worked at the Stewart Ranch bears mention is his name was Little Mouse. And this is a place named after him called Mouse's Tank. And if you've ever been to the Valley of Fire, you might have seen the Mouse's Tank trail. Now, Little Mouse was he was a hand on the Stewart Ranch, but he was also known for he was a really, really smart guy, but he also would steal things from people. And he was actually accused of murder. They say that he killed 2 prospectors as well. And so he had to go on the run. And the place that he decided to hide out was the Valley of Fire. And this was Mouse's Tank, where he would hang out around this area that usually had water in it, so they had access to water, but he could still hide out really well. Now, unfortunately, the posse did catch up with Little Mouse, and then they lynched him. So that was a sad thing. But Helen was, again, at the nexus of everything that was happening in the area. Everybody came through Las Vegas. And then let's talk about number 5, Stewart child number 5, and this is Archie Stewart. Now, Archie was named after his father, of course, who he never got to meet. And Archibald was the apple of Helen's eye, and she doted on him and just absolutely loved him. Apparently, he was a really good baby, a really easy baby, and we have lots of pictures of things when he was a kid, and she was just really, really happy to have her little family out there. A family of 5 in the middle of the desert, and a cute little baby bringing up the rear. So, one of the things that she was concerned about, though, was was education. And, part of the statue of Helen J Stewart down at the Old Mormon Fort is, it does show the books because, again, her parents took education seriously. She was educated, and she was raising her kids out in the middle of the desert and didn't know how she was going to educate them. And so she did find somebody. She found a gentleman, an Irishman, McGarrigle, and he also had the gift of gab, and he came down and educated the Stewart children for a few years. He lived there on the ranch. He became integral to the whole Las Vegas Valley and was quite a character. But unfortunately, he didn't live a long time. In his mid-60s, he died, and she actually interred him with her husband at the cemetery. In fact, if not far from the Old Mormon Fort is, Las Vegas's oldest cemetery. And this is actually where the Stewart family is buried, right down the hill here. In fact, my grandparents are buried, right here, right next to where Helen J Stewart and her family are resting now. So, education, it was always a very, very big concern. And in fact, as Helen J Stewart got money and started making money, she devoted some of that money to education, sent her kids down to LA for that. I also want to talk about Helen's social life and what she did. Again, she really didn't like to be alone. She really missed the company of women. But she also was able to make a special friendship with Jim Wilson up at Red Rock Canyon. So, for years they were, their families would get together. They would have picnics together. They would spend holidays together and things like that. And we actually found out that Helen and Jim Wilson had a romantic connection. Now, Helen's son, Hiram, her number 2 son, he really did not approve of Helen disrespecting the memory of his father. And so this was actually kind of a secret relationship. It was usually when the boys were away that they would get together. And, we actually find Helen's initials carved up in the sandstone behind Jim Wilson's house here. We also find in her diaries that Helen was afraid of getting pregnant. So, it's kind of cute that Helen had her romance here in the desert, her hidden romance that she had to keep hidden away from her children. And later in her life, she actually wrote this poem, and I want to read it. I don't know if it was written about Jim Wilson, but I don't know. You think about it. If you've been up here to Spring Mountain State Park and you've gone out here, here's where the Super Summer Theater thing happens. I don't know. I just want you to hear this poem. Think about Jim Wilson and maybe they're related. Hear the pine birds sing. Hear the echoes sweetly ring. Fountains dark and sparkling o'er the fern beds darkening. Come to me, your warrior bold, with feet so light and heart of gold. In his fastness here, the mountain deer has naught from you nor I to fear. Come over the mountain to your lover true. Come, my mountain flower, come, O dew. O linger not for the storms so cold, may delay for us and danger hold. Come to the valley, to your own true love. Come to the home of the nesting dove. I'll care ever and guard your sweetheart, till the Great Spirit calls us to part. In the desert land of the blue sage, where the rock bowl is the rain gauge, where the dry earth kisses the rainbow sweet, there, my dear, we will meet. So I like that. I don't know. I really do think that was about Jim Wilson, especially the line about "Come to me, your warrior bold." He was a soldier down at the fort and all these things. Then again, maybe totally not. Maybe I'm wrong, but I like to think about that. So again, Helen was kind of rocking it in Las Vegas. She was succeeding where gas and where the Mormons had failed. And she was actually developing a bit of wealth. She learned that the railroad was going to be coming through town. And so she decided to start investing money in land. And she started buying up all the land, especially that had water underneath it, because she knew that those steam engines would need that water. And she told her children, this is something she said, she often told her children to be patient and that civilization would catch up with them. She spoke of, and I think this is a great prophecy, seeing the glint of the rails, the smoke of the trains, and homes and church spires in the grain fields on the hill. So she had a vision of Las Vegas, back when there were just a couple dozen non-native settlers in Las Vegas. She had a vision for what this would become. And if you look at it now, it's this culturally relevant city in the middle of the desert with 2.5 million people in it. And, she made that call really early. She also became the postmaster, and, and her little ranch was the post office for years. And her sons were able to start pitching in. So William, at 12 years old, they say he would start taking these solo trips. They'd take all this valuable cargo down to El Dorado Canyon. And her other son, Hiram, he was the rancher. So he was always, there with the Native Americans and on his horse and running around chasing horses and cattle and things like that. So Helen had really come into her own, and this was starting to make money and be a successful endeavor. Now, I do want to talk about this picture real quick. This is the old Helen J Stewart ranch house. And out here on this horse that you see running by, that's Las Vegas Boulevard now. And I just, again, looking at the, her prophecy and then thinking about what Las Vegas is now, I would love to see what she would think if we were able to take her out of her front door, lead her onto Las Vegas Boulevard and walk her down the street and show what this city has become. I think she would be, I wonder what she would think of it. So one of the things that Helen did, again, I said, she sent her kids to school. And I do want to tell one fun story about her kids going to school. So they lived we actually have the address and everything of where they lived. They lived right downtown Los Angeles on Hill Street, right across from Angels Knoll, right downtown. And this is where her, she sent her two daughters and Archie down. Her oldest two boys, they were pretty much feral. They did not take very well to the other teacher either. And, they were doing their thing. They were farming and ranching and really didn't see a giant value in education. But she sent her three youngest children down to Las Vegas. And, so here's Tiza, her oldest, and here's Eva and Archie. And Archie, actually, he was a rambunctious little kid. He got in a little bit of trouble. In fact, he showed up in the newspaper down in Los Angeles. This was from the Los Angeles Record, and talked about how Archie, at 12 years old, he got separated from his friends. So one of his friends said, "Hey, let's go to Pasadena." And Archie didn't realize Pasadena is like 10 miles away. So they go to Pasadena and they get separated, and Archie doesn't know how to get home. He didn't have any money. In the news report here, it talks about how, he was lying and wanted to go to Las Vegas and all this kind of stuff. But the reality was, he found the local sheriff, the local sheriff. He said, "Hey, I'm stuck here. Here's where my sisters live." So they sent word to them. And so, his sisters came and picked him up in the morning. But, really funny that he got lost, and, the way he was talking and the way that this reporter heard what was said, Archie wasn't afraid of walking home. He would, if he was stuck in Las Vegas, it didn't matter. He could walk home. Or, if he was stuck in Pasadena, it didn't matter. He could walk home to Las Vegas. And it just shows how independent spirited, these Stewart kids were. Now, a couple years after sending the kids to school, something pretty sad happens. In 1899, we're really lucky to have this picture. There are not a lot of pictures of the Stewart family, as you can imagine. They were out in the middle of nowhere, away from civilization. But somebody got a camera and took a picture of Archie when he was around 14 years old. And unfortunately, he would never see his 15th birthday. Archibald, he unfortunately was out riding his horse, chasing some wild horses outside of the ranch, and he fell and died. And so I just can't imagine how rough this was. Well, I kind of can, but Helen J Stewart had to, she had to bury this Archibald next to her old, her husband, and she had lost, two people that she really loved, in this quest to make. So Helen had lost, two people to make Las Vegas work. It was, really sad. And she put him alongside his old teacher and his father in that little family plot. And it was a really, really, really heartbreaking for Helen. In fact, we have some of the messages and some of the letters that Helen wrote to her daughter about just how sad that she was about losing her son. I lost a brother to a skateboard accident when he was in his 20s, and that was just devastating. I can't imagine losing your husband and then losing your son as well, especially a son that she'd put so many resources into, that she'd made sure to be educated and was just her favorite. And to lose him must have been absolutely devastating. And again, he's interred here at the family plot. And just what a sad time for Helen. Now, a year later, something else interesting happened. And this is going to be the last story we tell of Helen J Stewart in this first half of her life. Something happens at the Kyle Ranch. So this is a picture that was taken a few years later, but I want to talk about the main protagonists of the story are these two gentlemen on the left. This is Frank Stewart. He was actually one of the ranch hands, not related to Helen in any way, just happened to have the same last name. He would actually end up being her second husband a little bit later. And then William, her oldest, one day in 1900. So really not that long ago, was not the days that we think of vigilante justice happening. These two gentlemen decided to go and visit the Kyle Ranch. And the Kyle brothers, the Kyle father, he had passed away already. But there were two Kyle brothers still living there. And they didn't live after that day. They were killed. And I believe it was by Frank and William. In fact, if you go to the Mob Museum right now, there's this interesting display. Helen J. Stewart wrote a letter talking about the death of the two Kyle brothers. And what Helen says is that it was a murder-suicide. In fact, that was the story for the longest time, is that there must have been a disagreement between the Kyles and, they killed each other. But they actually had to reinter their bones, the bodies later in the 70s. And when they did that, UNLV actually studied them and realized that the caliber of bullets and the wounds that they found were not compatible with the kinds of weapons that the Kyles had at the time. But they were compatible with the kind of weapons that the Stewarts had. So, through forensics, we learned that that this was probably some sort of a revenge killing, or I'm not sure if it was for the killing of their father, of Archibald Stewart, or if it was for other grievances and things that happened over the years. But 20 years after they had moved in together and being the only neighbors, around, the only people in Las Vegas, it came to a bloody end. And I wonder how much Helen knew about that. I wonder how much Helen was involved, or, if she did think it was really a murder-suicide, or if she knew that her son and her soon-to-be new husband had exacted that revenge. It's interesting because, again, to make it out here in Las Vegas, you have to be you have to be a pragmatist. You have to be realistic about what's going on, and having that justice stripped away from her. And she wrote in so many letters about how much that affected her, the fact that she was that justice was not served for her husband's death. And then all these years later, at 1900, right before Helen J. Stewart would go on to do some other amazing things, this kind of frontier justice happened. And I think it was very, very interesting. And so that's where we're going to take a break for today. And I hope you enjoyed this story of one of the most amazing people who ever lived in Las Vegas. And she's going to go on to do even more amazing things. We're going to talk about, the corrupt, awful senator, the super rich guy that she has to go toe to toe with next. And then how Las Vegas almost slips back into the desert, and, the early days of Las Vegas and what she does to make sure that it's a real town, and not just a company, just not just a railroad stop somewhere. And I don't know. I think Las Vegas, Helen J Stewart is a name that we should all know. And we should also be proud of how she was able to make it where so many hadn't. So again, I'm Alan Rogers, and thank you for listening.